Hello, good afternoon and good evening. On behalf of the Global Interdependence Center, welcome to today's executive briefing. I'm Peter Gold, Chair of the GIC's College of Central Bankers and Vice Chair of the Board of the Global Interdependence Center. Today's executive briefing is part of our College of Central Bankers Institutional Alignment Project event series. This project is centered around the overarching question of whether national and international policymaking institutions are sufficiently equipped to address the impacts of high debt levels, digital currency, inequality, climate change, changing demographics, and independence and interdependence of central banking organizations. Working collaboratively, the College of Central Bankers and its community will be bringing this discussion and other activities to the global stage. Over the next hour, we will explore the central bank's role in climate change with two of our college fellows. Before moving along to turn this virtual floor over to Kathleen Stephansen, I have two very brief announcements. First is to acknowledge the fantastic leadership of Kathleen Stephansen, our moderator today as GIC Board Chair. She has led us through very, very interesting times in a very distinguished way, and I'd like to thank her on behalf of the College of Central Bankers and the GIC community. So thank you, Kathleen. And I'd also like to welcome Bill Kennedy on as our new Board Chair. Bill is a very familiar name to our GIC community, having led the program committee, and we look forward to Bill's guidance as well. The other quick note I'd like to make is that since we last met, Dr. Zidi Aziz from the Asian School of Business and former governor of the Bank of Malaysia has joined the College of Central Bankers as a fellow. And we want to thank her. If she's on the call, we thank you. And also just a quick thanks to our friends at MIT Sloan School for helping with the introduction there. So thank you for permitting me to make those two very brief updating comments. So moving along, I'm pleased to introduce again today's moderator, Kathleen Stephansen, again, Chair Emeritus of our board, Senior Economist at Haber Analytics and Trustee of EQAT Trust Funds. Kathleen, the stage is yours. Thank you very much. I look forward, as our audience does, to learning so much from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for this very nice introduction. And certainly I'm delighted to moderate today's session with our very distinguished guests. And as you mentioned, Peter, they are College of Central Bankers Fellows. So we have Katarzyna Zajdel-Kurowska and Christian Noyer. Just as a reminder for the audience, this event is being recorded, so you will be able to see a replay, which will be available on the GIC website. Now, given the tight agenda, I will only take a very brief moment to introduce our speakers, who will share their remarks first, and then we'll open it up to the audience questions. So Katarzyna Zajdel-Kurowska is currently serving as alternate executive director at the World Bank Group, and she's held this position since 2018, representing several European countries, most notably Poland. Katarzyna also has held leadership positions as board member of the management board of the National Bank of Poland, which is the central bank, responsible for reserve asset management and financial and operational risk management. And before that, she was Poland's alternative executive director, representative of the IMF. And prior to joining the IMF, Katarzyna held the position of Deputy Finance Minister, responsible for economic and financial policy, public finance and debt management, and regulation of financial institutions. And prior to her government career, Katarzyna was Regional Chief Economist for Citibank Handlowy. Christian Noyer is the former governor of the French central bank, Banque de France, a position that he held from 2003 to 2015. And in this capacity, he also chaired the board of director of the Bank for International Settlements, otherwise known as the BIS. And that was from 2010 to 2015. And from 1998 to 2002, Christian served as the vice president of the European Central Bank when the bank was set up in Frankfurt. Prior to his career at the ECB and at the Banque de France, Christian was in the French government, covering domestic and international policies. He was the chief of staff of two finance ministers in the mid to late 1990s and director of the French Treasury before that. And in the late 1980s, he also served as an advisor to the then finance minister Balladur. So we will first hear a few comments from Katarzyna, and then we will hear from Christian, and then we'll open it up to a very, I think, interesting and lively conversation. Katarzyna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Thank you, Peter, and welcome, Christian. It's a great opportunity that we are all together today talking about climate change. I will also refer to some activities that you, as a governor of the Central Bank of France, you initiated some climate change discussion. So definitely this is a great topic, very up to date. I think that everyone now talks about climate change, and I'm pretty sure that everyone have seen this famous chart that or cartoon that is reprinted in every newspaper with the three waves. Small wave is the COVID-19. Then you have the middle wave, which is recession or crisis, and then you have a huge wave with the climate change issue. And definitely climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing us all. It is not only about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This is about economic and social transformation, and with economic and social implications going forward. It is already expected that the transition to net zero emission will be inflationary, especially over the course of the next decade. You probably are familiar with the name called greenflation, which is the result of the higher prices resulted with the greening of economy. But this green inflation means that we should expect higher inflation going forward because of rapidly increasing investments in the area of the green technologies, which will impact commodity prices. So definitely by higher commodity prices, we will have this impact on inflation going forward. But not only about commodity prices, climate change is also about higher food prices, abrupt climate events, drought, floods, earthquakes already put pressure on food prices. Additionally, greening the agriculture may trigger additional impact on food prices dynamics. So we already see it, but I think that we might see it if those climate change issues will not be addressed quickly. Climate change adaptation and mitigation both require substantial increase in infrastructure investment, from estimated currently $3 trillion per year to more than $6 trillion in coming decades. It will also increase demand for commodities and energy consumption in early years of transition, but will also drive higher commodity and energy prices, which will have upward pressure on headline inflation. So what is the role of the central bank in climate finance? According to Institute of International Finance, achieving net zero by 2050 might require the outstanding volume of climate aligned ESG bonds to reach $60 trillion per year, which is incredible increase given that last year the entire market of so-called ESG bonds was around $1.5 trillion. So this will have, so the role of the central bank would be threefold. First, as an investor, some central banks, they have already started investing their reserve assets in ESG and green bonds. So definitely they will somehow stimulate and steer the market as an investor. But of course, central bank is responsible primarily for inflation and price stability. So it might have a positive and negative implication via the asset purchase programs when by stimulating economy, the central banks are purchasing also ESG bonds. So by a reversal, it might have also implication on pricing. But also the central bank is a regulator. So central bank will play an important role in stimulating the discussion about ESG terminology, because one of the challenge at the moment is that we don't have a commonly accepted terminology, and this might somehow disturb the market and affect the greenwashing concerns. It is already important. The central banks, they play already important role as a regulator by introducing climate stress testing, and this is definitely the role that they will play going forward. Already, financial institutions are having those stress tests, implementing the climate change risk to the assets and the risks going forward. But on the macro level, institutions like IMF and the World Bank are also advising countries on assessing the climate risk on the financial market, but also economic and social development. So this will definitely be the role of large institutions, but central banks will be a partner in that. And the last point I mentioned, the role of the central banks in the discussion. It has already started with launching the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system. It was launched during the Paris One Planet Summit in December 2017. And the group of central banks and supervisors are on the voluntary basis already sharing their best practices and contribute to development and of environmental and climate risk. Also, there is similar institution or coalition of finance ministers for climate actions that bring together of financial economic policymakers from more than 50 countries to talk about the implication of climate change on economies, on inflation, on financial markets. So central banks are playing already important role in this topic, and definitely will play even stronger role going forward. With these remarks, I would pass the floor to you, Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna. And I want to return to some of the points that you made, but let's first hear from Christian and see what we can add to, the discussion. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Kathleen. I try not to repeat what Kasia just said, but let me start by saying that this is an issue that central banks do take very seriously, and I think the example of the network for greening the financial system, the the NGFS that Kasia just mentioned is a good example of that, a good demonstration of that. And that network groups many central banks, all the most important ones, and in particular the Fed, I think, joined at the end of 2018. So we really have the bulk of major central banks. Now, I would like to mention a couple of points. One is, how is it linked to the mandate? And second, what are the channels of possible actions by a central bank? The link to the mandate should be seen under two aspects: monetary policy, or the core of the mandate, and also financial stability, because most central banks have a role in ensuring price stability and the surveillance of the financial system. On monetary policy, which is the bulk of the mandate, there are, of course, various views to make it short. We have about the question, should monetary policy be green, that you already mentioned, Kathleen. We have the conservatives who tend to say the only focus should be the primary mandate, price stability, or the dual mandate. And if you get out of that, there is a risk of politicization, mission creep, so that's dangerous. And the activists, on the other hand, call for a change of the mandate. In my view, it's neither an abuse of mission or a militant consideration, but just an imperative to ensure properly achieving the primary objective or objectives and ensuring a smooth implementation of monetary policy. And I believe, on the famous question of neutrality of market operations, well, they should be neutral as long as they comply, in particular, with central bank risk control rules. Now, there are cases like the ECB where we have had in the past endless discussions, because we have the primary objectives and the treaty mentions sort of a group of secondary objectives, and that includes environmental protection. But I think we should not take too much of that, because if we focus on the primary objective itself, as Kasia mentioned already, we have a lot of examples of the link with the core of the policy mandate. I'll give 4 or 5 examples. The shocks related to climate change are difficult to manage. Stagflationary nature may result in price upward pressure and slowdown in activity. The transitional policy of whether it is carbon tax, regulatory changes, can affect prices themselves and generate inflation and weight on activity. Climate events clearly have an effect on activity and food prices. And we have sometimes, it's not only food directly. With the draft in the summer of 2018 in Germany, disrupted the Rhone River transport in Germany, and it had a clear effect on slowing growth. So the considerations about growth prospects were clearly affected. And then the question whether monetary policy was adapted or could have erupted. In the long term, of course, all those evolutions can wait on potential growth. So all the calculations about the stance of monetary policy in the medium term have to be redone. And it's serious. For instance, it is estimated today that for every degree centigrade over 25 degrees centigrade, labor productivity is reduced by 2%. So it is not just trivial. And finally, of course, the smooth implementation requires that balance sheet exposed to climate risks, whether they are risk of collateral, of assets, portfolio, have to be taken into consideration. Now, very shortly on financial stability, I think Kasia mentioned that already. The main channel of risk is the quality of credit of counterparties. There are also risks in equity, depending. I mean, if you have a risk in your balance sheet as a bank on a company that is developing a strategy to adapt to climate change, it's clearly a better risk than a company that would do nothing and risk being pushed out of the market at some point. And of course, all those risks are non-linear. They may come at turning points, so it is not always easy to assess in a short-term horizon, but in the medium term is quite clear. What possible action? I just mentioned a few things. Portfolios of monetary policy can be adapted. It has to be checked that, of course, it has to be in line with the mandate. It's not straightforward with supranationals or sovereigns, but it's important for corporates. Collateral for all the central banks that use corporate collateral. The importance of the haircut or the value of the way the valuation is done has to be adjusted. For own portfolios, foreign exchange reserves, own funds, for pension portfolios, or third-party portfolios like government, foreign exchange reserves, hold on behalf of governments, or in the case of the ECB, the foreign exchange reserves managed by the national central banks. I mean, there are a series of things that where it can play a role. And when we look at what the central banks do today, I mean, in the network, it's probably between a quarter and 50%, or even slightly more, of assets that follow a so-called sustainable and responsible investment policy. There are other actions. I mentioned just a couple of them. One is to adapt the forecasting models and incorporate all the changes in economic behavior, possible tax measures, the impact of higher energy prices on international trade, impact on potential growth, as I mentioned. And a second issue is the standards. Kasia already mentioned that. Central banks have to push governments to set up a regulatory framework, as of course it should be also as universal as possible, which means the Bar Committee has a role to play. We need to define also the methods, in my view, but we might have to come back on that. We should avoid, for also financial stability reasons and for realisms and in the economic transition, avoid a threshold effect. I mean, stopping immediately to buy bonds of companies that would not be that would have a carbon footprint judged too important might be an enormous mistake. First, it would create immediate risks, and second, you can have, just to take one example, you can have oil companies that invest massively into new energies and decarbonized energy, and they have the capacity to do it, and they should be encouraged to do it. So in my view, having a sort of decarbonization method to judge the strength of the counterparties and the risks for financial stability should not be a very simple thing, but a more sophisticated thing. And in my view, a good decarbonization method to evaluate the risks in investments of banks and of central banks, by the way, is probably even a stronger, can have an even stronger effect than just buying green bonds and doing nothing else. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Christian. So, yeah, there are many different topics here that we can touch on, and I will ask the audience to, if they do have questions. We did receive some in writing, but if they do have questions, please use the Q&A button that you have at the lower part of your screen. So you did mention, Christian, about the portfolios. What's interesting, and this comes back also a little bit to what you said, I'll use also your nickname, Kasia, if you don't mind, is about the green bonds. There was a study that was recently published by by Economist in the at the BIS, who mentions that at the end of the day, there is a premium, if you will, a cash risk premium, but it's still relatively small relative to what we might anticipate. So that it indicates that investors are willing to pay a premium when the firm issues, quote unquote, a social rather than conventional bonds, but it's still relatively small. So that brings me to ask you both, number one, will that change in terms of, the ecosystem of green bonds over time? And for you, Kasia and Christian, in terms of, the collateral, the corporate collateral, does it make a difference or not? And unless there is a categorization, if you will, in that you have a categorization of what would be the issuers with credible emission reduction plans, issuer focused on the mitigation or the adaptation policies, and then issuers that are more innovative in terms of trying to develop ways to reduce, if you will, carbon footprint, or to enhance green technology. Kasia, do you want to take it first?
Absolutely, and thank you for this excellent question. Well, I think that this is the discussion that everyone is now very much interested about, because the market is, as I mentioned in numbers, is still relatively small. So when you mentioned premium, also the premium is somehow related with the liquidity and also the problem that we see currently is terminology or methodology is not aligned, or this is not like or not harmonized, let me put it that way, which also gives some kind of uncertainty to both sides, issuers and investors. But definitely here is the role of central banks, but also governments in that discussion about harmonization of the market. As I also mentioned, we should expect this trend to increase in terms of the bond issuance, given the needs of the climate change mitigation and adaptation plans. It would be huge increase in the next years to achieve the goals of the net zero by 2050. So this would definitely increase the market liquidity substantially, but also will affect those premiums. So I do believe that this is the beginning of the trend. A lot has to be done still to work on the harmonization. This will be the role of institutions mentioned by Christian, like BIS, but also central banks. If I answered that question.
Right. Christian, do you have any comments on
collateral, and probably the same reasoning could hold for portfolio investments. But for collateral, it's clear that if you normally the haircuts in the European case, for instance, is calculated after the rating of the bonds, of the rating of the issuer. It's not clear today that the sustainability of the company, which is more medium to long term in terms of climate change than short term, is really taken into account. I mean, we know there are a lot of things that start to be done, but it's clear that for the banks, it makes a difference if your haircut is 20% or is 50%. It's not the same value in terms of refinancing capacity with the central banks in case there is a need for liquidity. It's not too apparent at the moment because of the extreme amount of liquidity that is in the market, but in normal times it does play a serious role. Now, on the other question, whether it's preferable to look at the sustainability of company in terms of clear plans to reduce the carbon emissions or clear commitments, and the capacity to be innovative. I think both are probably important. As I said, I mean, if you have an oil company that does absolutely nothing, you can imagine that by 2050, but possibly much before that, if the behaviors change and the car companies change their what they produce, the long-term future of all those companies may be very difficult, and then you might have problems and reductions in the value of equity and refinancing problems if nobody wants to lend to them. Whereas if you have another oil company that is investing heavily in solar and wind, for instance, then they are building their future using today's cash flow from oil and gas production to build something that might be very powerful in terms of the company in the decades to come. Now, one of the problems is that sometimes, for instance, if we look at bank regulation, the value at risk is normally looked at in the relatively short term, whereas those changes may take a number of years. So it's there that we need to improve on the judgment. The problem, of course, we could tend to ignore what will happen in several years. On the other hand, the literature talks a lot about what they call green swans, that is, extreme events that may completely disrupt part of the economy and change abruptly the behaviors of people. And then if you are a company that has not started to move because you thought you had a decade before it really would be imperative, you might be caught by this kind of extreme event.
Right. You know, but you touched on the fact that you know, some of the differentiations will take place because of rating agencies. But the challenge here, of course, is that we need to have a universally accepted standardization and classification. And, you know, as long as that is not happening, and we see already the differential between Europe and the US, for example, as long as that is not happening, it will take time, and it will have, some slippages, I think. Anyways, so, but turning to another issue, both of you said that inflation is likely to be raised. Now, I have a problem with that. Not so much inflation as such, but the fact is that how can central bank respond to this? You have a shock, you have higher food prices, monetary policy as we know it is not effective to really fight an event such as higher food prices, as long as it's in that contained, if you will. So how do you see central banks tackling an issue like that?
Well, I think that it's mostly by adapting the models to a changing reality. That is that you cannot fight it directly, but you have to take into account that with those underlying pressures that will be more important than in the past, the neutral interest rates, will eventually need to be adapted. And then the course of monetary policy will be slightly different. It's not that you will try to stop things that you cannot stop as a central bank, but you have to take into account what is the new stance that you can have with a certain level of inflation and perhaps a new growth potential that will take into account all those changes. So it's mostly that.
Yeah.
If I may add something, well, this is nothing new in the central banking. This is not climate change, the first big shock that is influencing monetary policy. We had other issues, technology shock, oil shocks in 70s and 80s, debt issues, other. So over decades, central banks, they were responding to different shocks. So I would say climate change is one of the shocks that we have to deal with. How to address, of course, the central banks needs to remain focused on inflation fight to prevent higher demands and to control prices, which is the key mandate of the central banks. And as Christian mentioned, it's impossible to directly influence those price increases, but you have to adopt your models, you have to adopt your philosophy, your way of thinking, including that risks on economy, because maybe it was not per se included to the modeling, to the economic research so far. Now it is much more persistent. This is much more visible, that risk, and definitely with a new technology, with energy transition, I do believe that those innovations, which are now maybe very expensive at that moment, like solar panels, wind and hydrogen, now it's expensive, but with more investment, it should become cheaper. So probably going forward, we should expect some price declines in the energy generation sector as well. So definitely, the central bank should remain focused on the key area, which is the price stability, and of course include that climate change risk to the assessment.
And Kasia, talking about climate risk, we've had quite a number of questions that came in a written form, and one, if I may just group them a little bit. One is really about the measurement of risk, and in that respect, should we consider financial institutions' exposure to climate risk as being systemic, if you will, or even should we have like the inclusion of climate risk or carbon density loans, if you will, portfolios? Should they be subject to stress testing? So those are elements here that, you know, are springing, that are novel in a way. What is your view on that?
Well, I absolutely think that the climate change is a systemic risk, and we should not ignore it anymore because it has stronger and stronger impact on the economic and social policies and growth. So definitely, we already see it. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this is not only about reduction of the greenhouse emissions and investing in the area of the energy transition. This has very broad implications on our lives in terms of agriculture, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of urbanization, planning, and so on and so on. So all this climate-related issues, climate-related financing, has to be included to the planning and stress testing. How to do it? Currently, there is a debate, as I mentioned, central banks, they are discussing among them how to standardize the approach, how they are sharing the best experiences about how to measure the risk. It is not so obvious, as you mentioned, Kathleen. This is new. This is something new, and it will take some time before we will come up with the common approach and harmonization. But definitely, it should be taken into consideration on the macroeconomic level planning, also and the economic assessment, both on the country level, but also on the global perspective as well.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, the ECB has, essentially been in favor of expanding the modeling capacity. Is that correct, Christian, on that front?
I think to follow up on what Kasia just said, is there a systemic risk with climate change? Yes, clearly. At an undetermined horizon, of course, but it's really the theory of green swans is something serious. You can easily imagine extreme events that unfold abruptly and that may trigger, say, the next financial crisis. So it may be in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, we don't know. But this has to be taken seriously, and if you do nothing during 5 to 10 years, when it comes, it's too late. So there's clearly a systemic risk that warrants to be taken into account. What can we do then? Stress testing, I think, is a very good thing. It's a very good way, because then you can judge in each commercial bank's balance sheet what are the types of risks it has, and the risk of losses that may come earlier than the extreme events, because a company will not, for instance, a car company would have done nothing to move towards more electric cars, and then can be pushed out of the market, at least in some regions, much more quickly than they thought. So there is a clear risk there that should be stress tested. Central banks have started, or supervisors have started, to try to organize stress tests. It's very difficult. It's really the beginning. But I think at least in the so-called pillar 2 of supervision, that is the risks specific to a bank that the supervisor may judge, I think they can, using the analysis of portfolios of what do they have, what do the companies which are the counterparts of the bank do in terms of adapting their business model to the new reality and the growing demand of the market for those type of carbonized products or less carbonized products, then you can differentiate and try to weight risks in a manner that is not precise today, that may be more precise once they have defined a stress testing methodology that would be more efficient.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, so one series of questions actually is about, you know, this policy objective and the biggest obstacles. And it seems that we talked about that, and the potential solution to central banks prioritizing the climate change as a mandate. And I think that there's not one solution. Presumably there should be a set of solution, and maybe the framework. If we can come up with a standardized classification, it's almost like half the battle, you know, being won here. And I'd like to maybe link this particular question to another one, which is there a process for a worldwide ECG credit rating standard, so that, you know, markets and market participants can determine the risk, as you, Christian, you had described. Obviously, risks, one can apply probabilities, and it's a bit different from uncertainties, but, you know, it's challenging.
Yeah, it's unclear for the moment what could be the best way to achieve it. We would very much need it. I totally agree to have a common methodology. Even inside Europe, there are things that are heavily debated. In particular, what do we do with nuclear energy, which is not carbon emitting, but not liked by some of the countries because of potential other types of risk. But I think there is no way, personally, I think there is no way we can achieve a net carbon emission by, say, 2050 if we don't use at all nuclear energy. So it's just a dream. And on the other side, how to treat gas, which is better than coal, and so maybe needed for the transition. So it's not easy to find agreement on. There are traditional differences in that sort of things between the US and Europe, although should not exaggerate that. But these are things that have started to be discussed in the international accounting discussions, and it's discussed between regulators, which may also advise the governments and parliaments in the major countries. So hopefully we might converge to not in details maybe, but to major conclusions among in particular America and Europe. And I think that will set the, if we can agree on that, on the major things, then it will set a standard for possibly the rest of the world. There are tendencies in some other regions to do greenwashing. At least it's the way we see it in North America and in Europe. But I think if we have agreements on major standard issues, that it will be followed massively.
Yeah, yeah. And Kasia, I mean, you know, the role of institutions such as the World Bank becomes really important then.
Absolutely, but I would like to say that I fully share Christian's assessment. First of all, countries, they need to come with the common approach, what is green, what is sustainable. And we are still debating among countries, not only in Europe, but between continents about what green means, what kind of investments are perceived or seen as a green. If nuclear, like Christian mentioned, if nuclear energy is clean or not, if gas should be used only for transition, or how to deal with the gas flaring, how to also calculate investments regarding the adaptation to the climate risks. So definitely, it's a lot of work ahead of us. I'm so glad that the central banks joined that conversation, and there is debate. MDBs around the globe are working on the common approach and the common methodology regarding sustainability and SDGs implementation. So definitely, all countries being members of those international community, definitely this discussion is easier. But absolutely, it requires good analysis and long-term vision, because many countries, they have fossil fuels legacy. It will take much longer to transition. Some countries, they already have nuclear power. Some are resigning from using that. So there is a lot of debate about what is green, and without having a green definition and sustainability definition, it will be very difficult. But I agree also with Christian that it's much easier to come to harmonization regarding statistics, regarding accounting, reporting, and so on. What is really needed is the definition of what is really SDG, what is really green, what is sustainable.
Yeah, and that is key. So we're back to this classification. But you touched on one thing about that central banks are kind of converging towards this recognition of the problem. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here. Would you agree with me by saying, well, there is somewhat of a difference in the US? The Fed is really paying a lot of attention towards the concept of inclusive growth. Whereas in Europe, the ECB and the Bank of England, just to touch on the two main ones, it's much more focused on green transition. So even there, and this is my own view perception, there is a difference. Agree, not agree?
I think you're right, Kathleen. I think you're right. It's well probably linked to the fact that the discussions in Europe about climate change have started probably earlier than in the US, and there's the debate in the US has been more focused on the other issue, which was seen as one of the potential consequences, or at least there was a possible link with massive asset purchase programs and in moving the relative wealth of different classes of the population. So I suppose it's been part of the debate, and also the fact that the social security programs are less important in North America than they are in Europe. So I suppose that there are good reasons why the political debate has been such, and the Fed had to take that into account and ensure that it was able to defend the way the policy was implemented for achieving the goal that has been set up by the Congress. In Europe, there was less debate probably about that, but a lot of political debate among European countries, in many or most of the European countries, about climate change. And the question raised to the central bank was more often that. So ECB had to pay more attention to that and explain or clarify how it could be done in full compatibility with the mandate, and what could be done, what could not be done. And for instance, I think everywhere the central banks tend to say we're ready to try to find out ways to assess risks and therefore incorporate in our policies for good reasons, in full line with our mandates. But if you don't, you governments define a taxonomy and say clearly what is green, what is not green, and that will make our task extremely difficult. And it's really a political responsibility that you should take.
Yeah, yeah. And Kasia, I mean, in that respect, given this, do you think that public institutions are ahead, or the private sector is taking a leading role through the financial conduits, if you will?
Well, it depends how you define the public institutions. Definitely, I would say international institutions are really ahead and are leading the conversation about the climate change implications and climate change challenges going forward. And this discussion then cascades down on a national level, but then on the corporate sector as well. There is no choice for the corporate sector to follow this conversation because, as we also discussed during this panel, this will have implication on the business model. This will have implication on funding, on the balance sheet, portfolio, investment, everything. So definitely, those that are left behind, they might lose the opportunity to adapt to the new environment and the new demand and new challenges or opportunities. So corporate sector is following, but absolutely the international financial institutions, multilateral institutions are leading the conversation, and corporate sector is lagging behind.
Is lagging behind. Well, I just see that Peter had just popped up, which what that means, right? It's that the time is up, unfortunately, because I could personally go on and on with this, but I just want to thank you both for these very, very interesting and helpful remarks on this subject, which is very difficult to define and put our hands around. So again, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
We can't hear you, Peter. You must be on mute.
Yes, thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Kathleen. So let's see, common terminology, stress testing, how to value bonds, green swans, credit rating standardization, very important questions and very important terms, maybe to creating a roadmap to standardization. What are the issues? What has to be considered, and what is the common harmonization? I love your word, Kasia, harmonization. But we've learned so much. Thank you, all three of you. And maybe I'm sure there is a continuing role for the College of Central Bankers in maybe adding its thought leadership to this discussion as we move forward. So again, thank you for spending time with us, audience. Thank you, speakers and panelists. And as a reminder, before we close, a replay of today's executive briefing will be available on the GIC website just a bit later today. We are excited to announce that the College of Central Bankers Institutional Alignment Project Series, this series, will continue on March 1st, 2022 with an executive briefing on workforce development and productivity. We'll be joined by College of Central Bankers Fellow Danny Blanchflower, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and I understand that registration is now available on our website. To find the video replays, explore GIC membership, learn more about the College of Central Bankers, or donate to the GIC, please do visit our website at www.interdependence.org. We really, really want to hear from you. And if you want to be involved in any way in any of these issues, sharing your talents with us. So on that score, as we conclude, we encourage you to take a 30 seconds to respond to our audience survey. Your feedback is important to us, and we appreciate you letting us know if we can improve our programming or if you have topics that you'd like us to address. Thank you for your attention. Have a good day. We're ending the webinar, and thank you all very, very much for participating. Fantastic content. Thank you.